It was while I was studying at the seminary that I began to really get interested in Gudina Tumsa's legacy and his theology as well. Um, um, when I was at the seminary, whenever our professor, especially coming from Norway, and we had a Norwegian professor that I specifically remember. His name is Johnny Bakke, and he's retired now and lives in Norway. And we often call each other now. He's retired, he's just staying in his house, and he sometimes, he calls me and we talk about some issues, and he's still writing, by the way, at this very age. I think he's in his early 80s right now. Wow. So when he was teaching at the seminary, he was bringing up some things that Gudina said that he heard on meetings, and and referring to Gudina as the champion of the theology of Makani Jesus and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that is what made me really be interested in knowing more about Gudina. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there were some debates on some controversial issues on the legacy of Gudina Tumsa as well. Mm-hmm. And there were some among the members of the EECMY, especially the students, mm-hmm. at the time, who viewed Gudina as somewhat politician and as someone who has got nothing to do with religion or faith or anything like that. And for them, he was simply a politician, and that is why he got killed. And there is no religious cause behind his days or something like that. So that was a bit frustrating for me. On the one hand, I used to hear from my professors that he was indeed a theologian and somebody that died because of his faith and so forth. And on the other hand, there were some students arguing that was not the case, and they were trying to, create a different image in my mind, saying he was indeed politicians. And later on, I came to understand that for some at the time, it's impossible to be both politician and religious at the same time. So that's why they had to, categorize someone as either a politician or, a religious figure, so to say. Mm-hmm. So there were those debates, and at the same time, some of the things that I hear from the professors at the seminary that really got me interested in learning more about Gudina. Mm-hmm. And I also knew that my father had worked on this before me, on Gudina Tumsa's legacy, and I had some information about that as well. So I was really curious why he was interested in this. Mm-hmm. And so all these added up and, created some kind of fuel in my heart, and so to say, I just began to study that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Many people refer to you as an expert on Gudina Tumsa, and the points that you brought up about his controversial legacy actually lead into our next question, and where I want to ask you, of course, Gudina Tumsa was a theologian first, but his theology was holistic, so it incorporated politics, economics, social life, and everything. So what do you think his legacy in these specific categories that people try to place him in? Like, what is Gudina's legacy as a theologian or a politician, for example?
Yeah, it's a very interesting to really see Gudina as a different person at the time, because it's like, especially when you just take a look at the context and try to understand where his theology is coming from. And specifically now, when he became the general secretary of the church, that is when the charismatic movement started in Ethiopia, exactly almost at the same time. And the Pentecostal movement and the Millennial Church and this charismatic movement in the Lutheran Church as well. So there was this high emphasis on the spiritual activity of the church, to the extent that they began to neglect the fact that they need to also be concerned, or that the mission of the church had to be somewhat broader than whatever happens within the four walls of the church, like the spiritual activity, so to say. So the people were so much attracted to like speaking in tongue and the healing ministry and so forth, that they have forgotten to be concerned about the human rights issues, and other aspects of ministries of the church, because Ethiopia is one of the poorest countries, so to say, and there were a lot of things that they had to deal with, and yet they were too much focused on the church activities. That was internally the fact. That was the church. And at the same time, when you look at the missionaries, even though they had years and centuries of legacies of doing mission, crossing Atlantics and so forth, during the time of Gudina, that is when they began to shift their understanding of mission to just to focus on development. So for them, mission was all about development and had nothing to do with witnessing Christ to others and so forth. And that is because, like, if you see the African history now, it was the time when most African countries began to gain independence from colonial powers, beginning the early 60s and so forth. So they were, for them, like, mission and development were the same for them. Whenever they talked about mission, it was all about development. So Gudina refers to this a one-sided approach to mission, one-sided approach from both internally from the church side and from the missionary side as well. So in between this, there were a lot of people suffering and the injustice that happens, and the poor and the widow and the downtrodden and the marginalized and all sorts of people in Ethiopia. And therefore Gudina had to wrestle with that, and convince the people that the Bible is not just Matthew 28 that speaks about evangelism or development work and so forth, but it is holistic. And if you take a look at the history of the Lutheran World Federation, and they actually acknowledge the fact that he is the one who came up with this idea of holistic ministry for the first time. And yet, almost all churches today globally are talking about holistic ministry. Almost everywhere, whichever school you go to, or whichever church you go to, every denomination, they talk about holistic ministry. For the Catholic Church, of course, it was, in the early 1960s, they began to talk about holistic ministry, but in a different way. It was just the Latin American Catholics related to liberation theology and so forth. And yet they also had too much emphasis on politics than the spiritual aspect of it, even though they just talk about it, just here and there. But Gudina's approach was so much balanced that in the Nairobi LWF meeting, 1975, that is when his idea of holistic ministry was embraced by the whole Lutheran Church, and acknowledged in their documents, and then others began to be convinced and work through on that. But for the Western churches, even though they were convinced with this approach, it really took them some decades to embrace this and move forward with it. And it was quite late in the early 1990s that they began to adapt that concept into their policies and so forth. But for the Macanesos, because of Gudina, it just became a foundation of what it means to be a church at the time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You've really given the aspects of who Gudina Tumsa was and his understanding and his legacy, as his holistic view involved him in all parts of life. And now we want to go into more personal questions. about some things that you have been doing. As Lens has been telling me, you've been really involved in maintaining and growing Gudina Tumsa's legacy, even as a student in the seminary. We wanted to ask you about the journals, the Gudina Tumsa theological journals that I believe you have been publishing, and there's also a theological forum. Could you give us some insight as to what these journals are about and how they contribute and continue Gudina's legacy and continue to expand it?
Yeah, you see, there were when we started this journal, I was in Ethiopia and working, with Gudina Tumsa Foundation at the time, and we had two concerns. And on the one hand, there wasn't as such written materials in Ethiopia done by Ethiopians, and that is what you also. I was recently in Kenya and doing presentations there, and one of the concerns that I heard from, now it's not just undergrad students, but these are PhD students in Nairobi, Kenya, telling me that they're concerned about why Africans are not writing as much as they should. Mm. And I was challenging them. Then what do you mean by Africans? You are an African and you are supposed to write. And it's that was the fact when I was there, and we were concerned about this. And Paul Hoffman from Germany also had shared our concern at the time, and that we agreed to have a platform whereby we bring together theologians and leaders of the church and so forth to just reflect on the legacy of Gudina Tumsa. And for some of our theologians to write articles and present their work on these forums so that we can publish the proceedings. And that is how it all began. And we published the first volume while I was there. And it just continued from there. And 4 more journals were published after I got here. So we got to the 5th volume. And so what I did after coming here is to just continue with like organizing forums. And the first year as I was here, Lensa was here, and Gerdeke from Germany and from different places. And we had really wonderful seminar at the time, and that was published as the 2nd volume. And, the 3rd volume, for the 3rd volume, I had to travel to Chicago and organize a different forum at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, where my father actually did his PhD there, one of the best schools here in the United States still. And some of the graduates from that school are still renowned scholars almost everywhere in the world. And so we did our 3rd volume as a proceeding of that seminar. And so that just continued until I got to the 5th volume. And then I had to focus on a lot of other research, and I had to pause a little bit. And I'm going to continue to do it a little differently this year because in our department here where I'm teaching now at Concordia University, St. Paul, I asked if I can start a publication, the publication company, or a kind of publishing house related to our university here. And this publication house or place will be focused on publishing works of the scholars from the global south, like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And I want to incorporate Gudina Tumsa's journal as one journal as part of this as well. So I just got the permission to do so. And I'm praying that God will give me the strength and the time to do this. And so that is what the journals were all about. And we had very, very insightful presentations from the people that knew Gudina while he was studying at the seminary. He's his own roommate, for example, and someone that worked with him in, Paul Wee, for example, who used to work with him. at a very different level. He was a reader of my dissertation as well. So I've made a lot of friends because of Gudina everywhere in the world. And in Sweden, and in 2009, I had the opportunity to travel throughout Europe and interview Gudina Tumsa's friends and who worked with him. And I've met a lot of friends at the time that I am still connected with. And I know that quite a few of them, when they were writing their biographies and so forth, and whenever Gudina's name rings the bell, then they send me email. So I had a lot of chat and send them some information and so forth. So that's what happened. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's really amazing. It's something that we would also be interested in taking a part in and just learning new things that, of course, he was unable to write. But speaking on the fact that you were talking about how African students were saying Africans aren't writing enough. Gudina Tumsa, as I'm sure you're aware, was a firm advocate for developing a Confessio Africana, or an African theology. Sadly, he didn't have the chance to fully develop it, but I think we can all agree that he paced the guidelines on the holistic gospel, which meant ministering to the spiritual, material, or physical needs of man as well. So I just want to ask you, if Gudina had had the chance to develop a Confessio Africana, firstly, what do you think it would have looked like? And secondly, how do you think it would have changed the history of the church in Africa, and generally the political, economic, and social and development situation that is, we can say, plaguing Africa today?
That's another great question. Wonderful questions, by the way. When I looked at the questions, I was like, wow, you must have read Gudina's work very well to
Thank
come
you
up
very
with
much.
these questions. And I really admire you for that.
Thank you very much.
Really great questions. So this question is a question that I've been reflecting on for years. And the if question: if Gudina were still alive, what kind of theology would have come about? But I would say Gudina, on the one hand, was deeply Lutheran, and you get to understand what he's saying if you get Luther very well. And that is why a lot of people in our church do not really understand well what he's saying. And as I said, even though I worked on Gudina Tumsa for so long, some of the things that he wrote, it made sense to me after I began to read Luther very, very closely, and at the same time, so he's deeply Lutheran on the one hand, and on the other hand, he was deeply African. He understood the African culture and the African context quite very, very well. And just like some other African theologians, like John Mbiti from Kenya, or I can name a lot of them, Kwame Bediako from Ghana, and others who are deeply rooted in their African in an African tradition and try to do theology within the African context. And I think Gudina Tumsa also did try to do that, and that is also what is reflected in his writings. So both being Lutheran and at the same time deeply rooted in the African tradition is where you can see the Gudina Tumsa's theology merging from. So my take is that for you to understand Gudina, you need to understand the Lutheran theology on the one hand, and on the other hand, you need to really have a good understanding of the African tradition, so to say, and especially the Oromo culture and tradition that he often refers to. And just like other Africans, when, for example, you read Mbiti of Kenya, whenever he talks about Africa, he's mostly talking about his own cultural, background and tradition, and reflecting on the Kenyan, from the Kenyan aspect of it, so to say, as a Kikuyu guy. So the same with Gudina, the Oromo culture, so to say, because Oromos are, holistic in their understanding about life and so forth. Mm-hmm. And for Gudina, to be holistic in your theology is not simply to be biblical and Lutheran, but also to be African as well. Mm-hmm. And that is why he criticized Luther when he talked about the two kingdom theology, if you have read that far. In Lutheran theology, there is the so-called, the theology of the two kingdom, the right and the left hand of God, and God working through the government, the right hand, and through the church, the left hand of God. So God works in both ways. And for Gudina Tumsa, that is like compartmentalizing, how God works, and the two are, and God is everywhere. And just don't say right or left hand, and it's like just God's work, and so for him, and I would say he would have produced an African version of what it means to be Lutheran, mm-hmm. and what it means to be a real, mission work or a missionary. And mission is defined in so many different ways today. But I think he would have come up with, like, not just the concept of holistic theology as we talk about, or mission in holistic terms, but I would assume that he would have come up with a solid, holistic theology that would have helped the church today deal with issues that you describe, whether issues related to economy or politics or the social life of our community today. Because even though our church leaders today talk about holistic theology, you wonder what they mean by what they say, and whether they have understood Gudina very well, or whether they're saying what they say because everybody is saying it anyways. But that is what what I get to notice. And you see, for Gudina, and one thing that I want to emphasize is, like, for Gudina Tumsa, and at the same time, for some other theologians of his day, for Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, the reason why Gudina Tumsa is referred to as the Dietrich Bonhoeffer of Africa is that for both of them, theology is about life. It's not something that you talk about or think about. It is something that should be reflected in your life. That means that that is going to cost you life. Then you go for it. Mm-hmm. But that is not the case for a lot of leaders during our time. Theology is theology, life is life. And therefore, what they do in the church and how they display life in public is something else. And that's why they're too much afraid for their life, or they how shall I put it? It's like their guiding principle, the leaders today, their guiding principle is to walk on a safe line, and to be safe at those times. Mm-hmm. And if what you say or your theology is going to endanger your life, then don't do it. But for Gudina Tumsa, whatever you think about, and whether you understand what he's saying or not, whether that is going to cost his life, and whether that is going to have a consequence not only on himself but on his family as well, his theology is his determination and his life, and it's not something that he writes about, but his real conviction from the bottom of his heart. So do we have those kind of leaders or theologians today? I don't think so. That is why he in Dietrich Bonhoeffer continued to be different than everyone else during their time. And that's why they are always referred to as, you know, martyrs of the church. And their theology gave a lot of sense for people.
Mm, mm. That's really wonderful. And the way you describe Gudina Tumsa as a Lutheran, he's a firm Lutheran. Paul, we actually compared Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Gudina Tumsa, saying their influence by Luther led them to believe that the state and the church were both responsible to God. I'm not quoting directly, just along the lines of what he said. And it's wonderful to see how you're actually giving, I can say, a practical or a tangible idea of how Gudina Tumsa would have applied or developed African theology. And I think one thing that's a part of Gudina Tumsa's African theology is the fact that he was living in a colonial society or a post-colonial society. He was living in both. He was born and he lived through the era where a lot of African nations were getting their independence, which I think really influenced him as he saw these underdeveloped, poor African nations, even after they received independence, depending on foreign countries or the countries that previously colonized them for aid. And Gudina has spoken or written a lot on the matter of aid, as his church, the ECMY at the time, present day EECMY, was in an aid relationship with Western churches that was dictating how they minister, which he firmly disagreed with. And he created a stance of self-reliance. He said, we need to be self-reliant as a church. Although the church is universal and we share resources, there needs to be a self-reliance. We need to be independent in that sense, that we shouldn't allow the matter of aid or material aid to dictate how we minister to our people. So I just wanted to ask you, on his stance for self-reliance, first of all, do you think, as Gudina did believe the church was a paradigm for society, he had created a 20-year plan, as I'm sure you're aware, for the EECMY to be self-reliant from the aid, missionary aid and Western aid. Do you think had his plan for aid been implemented, and his belief that the church was a paradigm for society, government, and everything, do you think that self-reliance could have spread to African continents? And even present day, the many churches, including the ECMY, are not self-reliant. So do you think, had his plan been followed, the church could have been self-reliant and it could have become a part of his African context or African theology and spread into society as well?
Yeah, another great question here. So, the issue of self-reliance for Gudina, I think, should be seen in different ways. And I used to understand this in terms of just finance only. But that I think was not the case for him. Financial dependence always leads to other kind of dependence as well, and it is so broad. And if you, for example, see the reflection of Gudina on foreign aid, for example, there were times when he had to say, come to help our nation or work with the church as long as you support the mission of the church. Because at the time, as it happens even today, some Western mission organizations, with their money, always follows some kind of pressure on the church, just as it happens with the governments as well. So it does seem that, by self-reliance, Gudina was pushing towards seeing a church that is that doesn't open its door for foreign dominance in one way or the other, theologically, and in many other ways, and that is one aspect of it. And on the other hand as well, now it's all about it's also about servant leadership. And it's like, if I can compare it with today's leaders, for example, for them, it's all about gain. And to be a leader is to gain something, to have better salary and better position and so forth. And I think he was also fighting with that understanding and emphasizing the servant leadership that we see in the church. And by reducing the salaries of the workers in the head office and the leaders and so forth, and also by making sure that those that are paid less in the church, like working for the church, are compensated rightly so that they can lead their life and support their families and so forth. Um, and and that was really, really smart. And for me, like, the two things that I just mentioned are the main problems that you observe in the church. And the reason why some are fighting over positions in the church today is because that involves a lot of finance, and they want to better their lives and so forth, rather than seeing it through the lens of service to the church and service to the community. And I think Gudina was trying to go against that as well. And at the same time, as I said, the Western missionaries are trying to have some dominance in a church circle by coming up with their finances and so forth. And the third way to look at this is also like the only way you can enable the church to do its best in a given community is, if it is self-reliant, and if it has got enough resources to do mission work. And without finance, without money, then you can't do much in terms of mission as well. So like during Gudina Tumsa's time, a lot of the budget of the church was coming from abroad, including their salaries and so forth. And that way you can't do mission. And at the same time, the church was growing. And 1959, when the church was instituted as, was recognized by the government, there were only 20,000 members. And by the time he was leading the church, it was getting into millions now, and 11 million members right now. So the church was growing, and it really needs to have, a broader structure that goes along with that. And you can't deal with growth without also growing in terms of being self-reliant, in terms of finance and so forth. That is also a very smart way to look at the future of the church, and make sure that the church becomes self-supportive in that way. So for Gudina, all the things that I just said are reflected in his writings, in relation to self-reliance. It's not just about finance, and it's also about servanthood and serving the church as the servant leaders, and at the same time making sure that whatever money comes from the West, is not meant to impose some kind of ideology on the church leadership.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Me as an individual, when I was reading about his relationship with the West, I did only see it in a financial aspect, although he does talk about sharing spiritual resources as well. So that is a great eye-opener for many people to understand the time and the context that Gudina Tumsa was speaking in. Continuing on the topic of resources between the church, Gudina Tumsa, we can say he viewed the body of Christ as universal. He writes about a universal church that shares both financial and spiritual resources. Not only do they share, but they're equal. He believed that if I think he wrote something along the lines of, if our motives or if our missions coincide, we can work together to do something. But you can't come and put a criteria on us or create a certain kind of idea that only applies to you. And, I think this was really well expressed, the idea of a universal church, when he was in Hanover, Germany, and he presented the criticism on I think you know Mr. Welgay and what he tried to federate the already unified EECMY using an unrecognized, we can say unrecognized institution. So do you think that Gudena's idea of a universal church that is consider everyone equal, shared spiritual and financial resources, because he believed that it was God who gave the Western church what they had, and it's their responsibility to share with the rest of the body without any specific criteria, because it's God's gift. So do you think that a universal church is possible today? And how can we use Gudena's understanding of a universal church to build that kind of oneness in the body of Christ?
Yeah, well, with this question now, there is one thing that I would like to note, and which you, I think, need to be careful in the way, Gudina was dealing with this issue at the time, and what happened at the time that that he criticized the Germans for what they did. At the time was like when he became the general secretary of the church, 1963. Now the church was dealing with one problem, and that was like the different mission organizations, so to say, had their own territories throughout the country. Like the Germans had their own in the west, and the Swedes in the south, the Norwegians in the south, and the Swedes around Addis and so forth, and somewhat in the west as well. And like others, Americans in the north. So they almost divided the one church, the Lutheran church in Ethiopia, into different spheres, and they had their own culture and tradition. And the Germans emphasized, for example, the pastoral ministry, as we see in the West. And in the southern part, the Norwegians did not care much about pastoral ministry. They did it; they were pietistic, so to say, and they had their own ways of doing stuff, and they were just picking leaders from the fourth grade and so forth. And therefore, it's like the liturgy and everything was so different everywhere. So he was really concerned about this, and he wanted to unify the church by making sure that there is uniformity in the way they do their worship services and so forth. And he wanted to make sure that the mission organizations also understand that they're dealing with the one church, and doing it what they do differently is kind of dividing the church. Now, the other thing that he was also concerned about is that, for example, the Germans, whenever they dealt with, the church, they did it in a way that they kind of ignored the top leaders, including Gudina, and directly dealt with, for example, the synod in Walaga, or the synod in here and there. So they were just financing them and doing their own stuff without any consultation with the head office. So he was disturbed with that, and therefore he wanted to show that they're dealing with one church and not a divided church, that has different ways of doing stuff, and that he wants to remind them that this is, their approach is going to eventually affect the church, bring division in the church and so forth. So it was a challenge to these mission organizations, and he actually did it. He is the one who unified the church by convincing, and in a nice way, And the best thing about Gudina is that he doesn't make argument for the sake of making argument, and he is a great theologian, so he does theology. And he shows what his theology in practice at the same time. So he brought the church together, and he unified the church that way, and challenged the missionaries in the way they do they deal with the regional synods as well. And starting, now, for example, any mission organization cannot bypass the head office and deal with the synod either in the west or south or east today, and they are structurally forbidden to do so. And that is because of what Gudina did at the time, just to make sure that and here in the United States you just can't do that. If it is an international communication that you're doing, and everything has to be done through the leaders, the head office, and so forth. And yet, when it comes to Africa, they want to do it in a very in their own ways, in a way that it divides the church, and the same with politics and so forth. So that is what Gudina was against at the time, and he was really successful in many ways.
That's wonderful. Continuing on the topic of unity in the church, from Gudina's writings, we can see he was really a part of the ecumenical movement. He wrote extensively on it. Not only did he write, but he even formed the CCE, Council for Cooperation of Churches in Ethiopia. He was a part of the people who formed it, and he was later elected the chairman of that council. In that council, he not only incorporated evangelistic Christians or Lutherans or Protestants, but he also included the Catholics and the Ethiopian Orthodox. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about Gudina Tumsa's approach on ecumenical harmony, and where did he get the idea to establish it in the way that he did? Not only that, but do you think it's possible for that movement to, I would say, get reignited again and create the means for, ecumenical relations within the churches of Christ?
Yeah, well, there are two ways to see this. Like, by the way, there are lots of people who feel like because he was advocating for ecumenism, that he is advocating for a one universal church, the way the Catholic Church is arguing about that there should be only one church and one bishop, and at the top, living in Rome, who is going to be in control of the whole church universally, or something like that. No, that is not what Gudina was arguing about. And for him, there are different denominations and different churches and different theologies, and yet mission is one. And there is only one mission, which is holistic, and that the church needs to come together and to witness Christ in different ways, by advocating for those who have, those that are in prison, and the ones that are, marginalized and downtrodden and so forth. And at the same time work on development issues and so forth. And that is how the CRDA, for example, the development organization that brings all these different denominations together, came about. And the Evangelical Church Council that you just mentioned, it was called Evangelical Church Council, afterwards anyways. But it all began with the council of all these different churches, including the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And Gudina was sure that, he was very optimistic that if Christians come together, then they can make a difference on their people, regardless of their differences in their theology and in their understanding of the scripture and so forth. And, if you unite, if you bring together these religious leaders, and they are really honest in what they mean by serving the people the way the gospel says, then they can really impact their community in a very positive way. So he initiated this idea, and he took the leadership, and he brought them together. And the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, they left for different reasons, and I would say, of course, Abuna Theophilus was his very close friend, and they died the same day, in 1970, 78, 79. The same day, the leader of the Orthodox Church, Abuna Theophilus, and the leader of the Muslim council at the time, and Gudina Tumsa, the three of them, they were executed the same day, and at the same place. And he was not ecumenical just when that's why I'm saying whenever I talk about Gudina, his theology and is about life. So when he talks about being with other churches and with other leaders, and if that means that he's going to die with them, then he will just go for it. And he died with it. And so he brought them together, and he took the leadership, and that is for the sake of, again, doing mission in the right way, so that they can all come together and impact the country in a positive way, because this is Ethiopia that we are talking about, one of the poorest countries, and how do you deal with issues related to development? And if you don't make sure that you don't pull all resources together, and especially if you are a religious leader like him, and so for him to be ecumenical is not just for the sake of just entertainment that you bring together to people to talk about some issues, and in most cases that's what they do today. No, that's not the case for him. It's all about making an impact on your community, positive impact on your community, and changing the life of the people in different ways. And that is what is reflected in his writing, for example, when he talks about the unity of the church, and arguing based on John chapter 17, where Jesus prayed, saying, just as I and you are one, then my prayer is for them to be one as well. And that is the foundation, the main text that he takes on whenever he talks about unity within the body of Christ. So that was very essential for Gudina Tumsa to come together, not for the sake of just having fellowship with each other or so forth, but to do mission in a way that you make impact on your community.
We've covered a lot of topics. We've talked about Gudina's view on holistic theology, contextualized their African theology, ecumenical harmony, and whatnot. And now I'd like to go a little bit into the past of Gudina Tumsa and ask you a question about his time in the United States at St. Paul in Minnesota. He was there from 1963 to 1966, which we can say was the beginning of the intense civil rights movement. And many people write, like Oyvind Data, Paul Wee, they write that Gudina Tumsa was heavily influenced by not only the activity that was going on then, but by the leader of the civil rights movement, which we can say is Martin Luther King Jr., who was a reverend. How do you think Martin Luther King Jr. influenced Gudina Tumsa, and how do you think it led to Gudina Tumsa taking the stand he did when it was his time to stand up against oppression?
Yeah, after I came to Luther 11 years ago, and one of my interests was like, what did he actually learn during his time? What was the curriculum like, and what did he read, and where his professors and so forth. So, and I was so happy when I learned that the dean at the time, his name is Martinson, and when I came here, Martinson was the dean of the school, and at the same time he was a student during the time of Gudina. So I had interesting conversation with him. He knew a little bit about Gudina, but he knew the context about what they learned in the textbook that they read and so forth. So at the time, Gudina was reading two very influential figures, and one is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and one of the row here is all about Bonhoeffer here, this line, you know, and all of his works and so forth. So he became one of my favorite theologians since then. So Bonhoeffer, he read him, and also the other influential person that he read was Niebuhr.
Yeah.
Niebuhr was somewhat, he was a theologian, but too much focus on ethics. So what does it mean? How do we talk about ethics from a Christian perspective, especially political ethics and so forth? I have some of his works as well right up there. So he read those two main theologians and Luther at the same time. These are Luther's work, all the red part over here. So he was, the three, like Luther, Bonhoeffer, and Reinhold Niebuhr, not Richard, but Reinhold Niebuhr. And those were very influential during his time. And by the way, they are still the three main, influential theologians during our time as well. So if you don't know any of the three, then you're not considered as a true theologian and anywhere. So you really need to understand these three to be considered as a true theologian in the Western world today, for some reason. Anyways, now for your question, so he read them at the time, and those were the ones that shaped his thinking about the church, and especially in terms of shaping his idea of what it means to be a church that is concerned about people that are marginalized and the downtrodden and so forth. Now, at the same time, Dr. King was becoming popular in 1960s. That is when they were demonstrating on the streets, and he was a student here. So one of his professor at the time, her name is Sarah. And when I one time it was really funny. Like I was walking out of the library, and I was working on my dissertation, and I so tired, and I was walking down the stairs, and I saw an old woman trying to walk on the stairs to go to the library, and I felt like I should help this lady. So I asked her, like, would you mind helping you walk on the stairs? And she was like, oh yes, please. And I took her hand, and we slowly walked, and she turned to me finally, and she was like, who are you? Where are you from? And I said, like, name is Samuel, and I'm from Ethiopia. And she looked at me, and she was like, do you know Gudina? And I was like, well, where do you know him? And she was like, I was his professor when he studied here. And I was like, I'm hungry, I want to go home, but I really want to talk to you. So we sat together, and I thought that was going to be about 10 minutes conversation, but it ended up being about 3 hours conversation at the time. That was for real. And I forgot, everything, and I was just listening to what she was telling me about. And, I can't tell you because of our time, everything that I hear from her, but the two things that she emphasized was like, she told me one funny thing and one other, a real thing connected to your question. The funniest thing that she told me is like, the dormitory where he stayed, and between the dormitory where he stayed and the classroom, there is a tunnel, underground tunnel. So during winter time, when it was really, really cold, the snow and so forth, he only used the tunnel, and he never saw outside. And the only time he went outside was when he went to the church. So, and she told me, it's like, whenever he came to the classroom, he didn't have to wear a huge, clothes like anyone else, because he was just walking from his dormitory to the classroom, just through the tunnels. And she said he was terrified of the snow, so he didn't want to look at what happens outside until the the winter was over. So that was really funny. And the other thing that she told me was that he was too much engaged in the social rights movement at the time. And he picked up issues that he heard on the news, and he was very attentive reading the newspapers and and watching on the news and so forth, and bringing those issues to the classroom and talking about that and discussing with the students as well. And she told me that most of the students, he in her class, he was the only Black student at the time learning the New Testament. She's a New Testament professor. And she said, like, there was a time when others were frustrated with his questions. And he was like, well, if you are frustrated because I'm talking about the poor and the marginalized, and there is no way that you should be in this classroom and learn about the New Testament, because that is what the New Testament is all about. So and she she told me that a few left the class because of that and didn't return back. And the next day she saw him and she was like, well, because of you, some students are not coming back. And she was trying to accuse him, and she said he smiled and he said, well, that is for a good reason, he said. Because if they can tolerate talking about the poor and the marginalized in the classroom, then they can't tolerate being a pastor for the future. So that is what I hear from him. One of the things that I hear from her. So that was Gudina during the civil rights movement here. So he was truly influenced by these main theologians that I first mentioned that he read at the time, and Dr. King's arguments at the time in the social rights movement. And of course, one of the things that surprised me, but nobody talked about, is that he was also not interested in, like, it was not about Dr. King, but it was more about Malcolm X, that he was really, his idea that he was engaged in. And I heard this from two professors, but I don't see that in his writings. But and I have read Malcolm X works as well, and he's somewhat very, very radical compared to Dr. King. But I was not sure why he was really engaged in reading and also having a conversation on the works of Malcolm X. Yeah.
That's a wonderful point. There's a short question that I want to ask you. Or even Ada refers to Gudina Tumsa as the Ethiopian prophet, and others also call him a prophet. And we've covered the topics he's discussed, which we can say are clearly still relevant today. So do you think Gudina was a prophet? And if so, how accurate of a prophet do you think Gudina was throughout his ministry?
Yeah, you see, the word prophet by itself, interpreted differently, and for a lot of people, to be a prophet simply means to prophesy, like to get a message from God and prophesy about the future and so forth. But the other way, the word prophet is interpreted, which or even Ada is referring to here, is interpreting your own actual time, and it's like it's not about the future, but to be able to have the capacity to describe well the situation that the people are going through, even at the very present time. And that is what the Old Testament prophets do. They don't only prophesy about the future, but they actually describe what it means to live in their own time.
Yeah.
Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and all of them, for example, if you closely read them, what they do is like, unfortunately, during their time and also our time, people are blinded about what they are experiencing at the present time. And you will be surprised. It's like, this is your life. How come you don't get it? And yet sometimes, God had to intervene and open their eyes for them to see, what it means to live in during their own time. So Gudina is a prophet in a way that he was ahead of his time in terms of understanding the politics and understanding the social and other issues that the people were going through, and interpret that through the lens of the Word of God. For example, when the military government came into power in 1974, he was still the general secretary of the church, and the issue of like socialism and communism became popular in Ethiopia. And a lot of people were attracted to this ideology, and including Gudina himself. He thought at first that there were some good things in socialism at the time. But the question is, like, how do you see that, interpret that through the lens of the scripture? So he was ahead in a sense that he had organized some seminars on this. Actually 2 seminars, and Gary Deke and Paul Hoffman and quite others were also involved in these. And I met some in Berlin and other places that came to do these seminars in the United States during his time. He was ahead in terms of understanding the consequence of what it means to be a socialist, and what it means to be a church in the context of the socialist movement and so forth. And he was also a prophet in the sense that he opened the eyes of the leaders and the people at the time to see and understand what they were going through, even though that is you feel like it's quite normal for everybody to understand what they face and what they go through. Just like you can't eat something without knowing what you're eating anyways. But unfortunately as human beings, that is our reality. We eat, and yet we don't understand what we're eating. And by food I mean like all kinds of things that you take into your body, into your brain and yourself, without understanding the impact that is going to have on yourself. And that is, the ideologies and all these, political things and racism, ethnocentrism, and whatever you see out there that really is was affecting, the people at the time. So he really was different, and that is what even Ada was referring in his articles.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. And just to second on your point, you said Gudina Tumsa understood from a historical and his time, and that's how he was a prophet, one aspect of him as a prophet. In his writings, we can see when he says that God is the God of historical development, and we as Christians should use that historical development to interpret the signs of our time. So just to second on your point, I really want to thank you for that. And as our interview comes to an end, we want to ask you a more personal and maybe personal question that leads into our final question. As Lesa Gudina was telling me, you had written a paper when you were in the seminary. You've also mentioned at the beginning of the interview, there was a lot of speculation around Gudina, whether he was a theologian or a politician. You wrote a paper called "Is Gudina Tumsa Dead or Alive?" And it was about some students claiming that he didn't actually get killed. He went and he joined the Oromo Liberation Front, or the OLF. And I want to ask you, what do you think about these speculations? And how did your paper address these speculations to actually place Gudina Tumsa's legacy as the truth, what the truth is, basically? Yes.
Yeah, you see, here's what I can say now, Kolo. Like in Ethiopian context now, somebody's defined, and I can answer this in multiple ways. Now, one way to see this is like, people are defined in a weird way. Now, I say weird, and mainly because now, on the one hand, for example, is it possible to be a religious figure and a politician at the same time? And of course. And was Jesus even a politician? And I would say, of course, yes, he was.
Yeah.
And did he talk about politics? Yes, that was his message in some ways. He talked about the poor and the rich and this and that is about economy and the social life of the people and so forth. And he was holistic in many ways. But still, to the present time, for a lot of people, the two cannot be taken together. And if you become a leader, for example, today, and you talk about politics, then and you post that on Facebook, and you will find out that most of the comments will be like, when did you leave the church, and when did you stop being a Christian, and so forth. That is so weird for me. Now, how long have you been in the church and you don't understand this? And that is why I say this is weird. And on the other hand, the other weird stuff that you will continue to face in the future as well is like people will define you without even knowing and listening to you and so forth. They'll just define you based on your ethnicity. And it's like, because your name is Kolu and you're Oromo, then you're just defined, And whatever you say, it goes through the lens of how they define you and how they define the whole Oromo and so forth. And that's why for him, just because he's talking about the human rights and he's Oromo, then he had to be one of the main OLF, leaders and so forth. Whereas I did interview Lenjo. Lenjo is still in Ethiopia, by the way. You can interview him as well. And in 2009, and he was living in Norway at the time. And when I interviewed him, and I clearly asked him, was he OLF or not? Just tell me this. And I really want to hear from you. And he was like, he was even opposed to our ideology at the time, he said. And I was like, why was that? And he was like, because we were advocating for just Oromo. And Gudina Tumsa was like, I am the church leader and I can't just say Oromo, but I have to be concerned about the human rights issues in general. And not only that, and he also advised them that they can't win the Oromo cause by just only advocating for Oromo only. And he said, advocate for the human rights issue in the whole country for all people, including the Amharas and the Tigrayans and so forth. And that way, you will gain success in what you want to achieve for the Oromo people as well. So he was opposed to them being just the Oromo group, so to say, and he was advocating for a more broader political approach, and both from his own religious perspective as a pastor, and at the same time also arguing that is the way politics should be done in a country. And as Lenzo said, you are the fan of Abiy Ahmed, Dr. Abiy. So that is what he's standing for, just for the all people, and that is why I also like him as well. Now, the other the other thing related to that is like, the Derrick government also, when they executed him in 1979, they didn't want people, to understand and know the causes behind his death, the real causes, I would say. So they had to come up with their own version of a story and that is where I also had the opportunity to interview Mengistu himself, and that is what I observed. And for him, for Mengistu Haile Mariam, it's like, he was OLF. And I'm like, how do you define him as OLF? Did you find like something really concrete, like, and he's like, well, he followed the cause of the OLF and the OLF, which is the liberation of the Oromo people and so forth. And did you actually hear him say that? And of course, no. And the issue is like, if you are Oromo and you are talking about liberation, still today, you are directly associated with OLF. Mm-hmm. And I am Oromo, and if I speak in public about the human rights issue, and especially if I say, like, the Oromo suffering and so forth in particular, and people will automatically associate me with OLF and say he's still part of that. So I think that was exactly what happened at the time. But and the more I talk to people, investigate and talk about this with OLF leaders all the time and so forth, the more I'm convinced that he had a different ideology. And I would be convinced if they were to say there was one political party at the time named Mason, which was advocating for all people to come together. And just as Gudina Tumsa said, and if they were saying that he was part of Mason, I could have easily believed what they said. But I think Mason was more active after he was executed. So that is what I could observe.
That's wonderful. And even to second on your point, the fact that he didn't only believe in the Oromo cause, I think it's Paul Hoffman in Life and Ministry that writes, while on an interview during 1973 on the radio Voice of the Gospel, RVOG, they were discussing about what should be the new political stance for Ethiopia. And Gudina himself said that a constitutional monarchy was a possible option for the future, which just shows even more into his fact that he did not believe in only advocating for one specific group of people, whether ethnicity, wealth, or even faith. So it really shows, to just add to your point, that's what I wanted to say. And our last question is a topic that is probably very sad to some people. Some people may not value it, but we wanted to ask you, as you are an expert on the life and ministry of Gudina Tumsa, do you think that Gudina Tumsa made the right choice when he chose martyrdom, when he chose to give up his life for, what he takes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer and writes as the cost of discipleship? He says, when Christ calls us, we are called to die, not necessarily in the way he did, but die to different aspects of life for some of us. But for him, he claimed his calling was to die for the gospel. So what do you think on how Gudina Tumsa was willing to surrender himself to death based on his belief that it was God's will for his life?
Yeah, when I saw this question, I was just laughing because one of the courses that I teach here is on Christian vocation. Mm-hmm. It's a new course that I designed and I began teaching. Now, what does it mean? What is a Christian vocation? Mm-hmm. And one of the article that I asked the students to read was exactly Gudina Tumsa's writing on what it means to live for Christ and to die for Christ and so forth. And they read about Gudina Tumsa, and one of the questions that I got from one of the Chinese students was like, is that the right decision? Did he make the right decision by uh, letting himself be a martyr? And that is really a tough question. Really, really tough question, because when you look at the consequence, that is not easy, and on the family and on everything. Now, in 2017, when I graduated from here, I really wanted to return back to Ethiopia. And I really did. And but my wife said that she doesn't want to go back to Ethiopia. Not today and not tomorrow and forever. And that was a blow on my face. And I was like, I really struggled with this idea. What would I do now? And how can I leave my children and my wife here? And just like, there are a lot of others who left their families here and went back to Ethiopia. And yet I decided to remain because I just couldn't be separated from my wife and my children and so forth. So let alone living, and it's like, this is America, and I could have simply decided to leave them here and know and understand that they'll be safe anyways. But here, his decision and his wife being in prison, being tortured for over 10 years, and his children flee to a country that they had never been to. And so that is really, if you take it, like if you closely see the story behind all this, it's not an easy decision. It's not an ordinary decision that anybody can take. We even fail in very minor decisions. Just the very example that I just gave you related to myself. So is this really the right decision? I don't know. My simple answer is I really don't know. It's beyond a human understanding, and it's really beyond my understanding. But what I can simply say is that it always, always, always amazes me to see his determination, his theology, his life, Christianity, and his faith. It's not something that he took for granted. And today, and especially following that, we have a lot of Christians today, and I am sure you have encountered a lot of people that made you question whether they're truly Christians, because they don't live what they say, and what they preach on the pulpit and the way they live their life are so different. And this have led a lot of people to question Christianity itself. A lot of people, and I might be one of them, but when it comes to Gudina, just by looking at the way he led his life, because of his determination, a lot of people have come to the church and have believed in Christ and have continued to have in hope and in the reality of the gospel. And so his faith, his theology was his life. And that for me is something that I daily pray about and that I daily aspire for, and for my theology and my preaching to be my life, and for me to be like somewhat like Gudina in this sense, so that whatever is reflected in my life is the truth of the gospel, no matter what the consequence. You know.
The last question, sorry about that,
Okay.
is I wanted to ask you, what is one thing that you think today's world, today's society, today's youth and church can take from the life and ministry of Gudina Tumsa, and should learn from it and apply it in today's context?
Oh, a lot of things. I could say a lot of things, but like, for example, we can just mention a few of the main and the general things that you can read in his writings and so forth. As like, um, you know, to be, here they talk about being a concerned citizen. And everywhere I go, they're like, "Are you a concerned citizen?" I get some mails and so forth, and it's like, "Are you a concerned citizen?" And let's do this, and that is related to issues of human rights or something like that. So the question of being a concerned Christians, a true Christian, and a concerned Christian in a sense that we feel responsibility for what happens in our context, and that we don't forget that that we never and that we don't forget that even though we're doing well in terms of how we live our life and so forth, that there are lots of people that are suffering somewhere. And like when I was working with GTF, and when I went to Fantale and saw the people and what GTF, for example, is doing there, and it's like, I just couldn't breathe at the time when I got there, and still Paulo is living here, and he talks about it, and he makes fun of me, and I'm like, you guys should drive me back to Addis, and I can't breathe here; it's too hot and so forth. But Lenzo and others, they were so determined, and you can see it on their face, and it's not about the weather or anything for them. It's about the people. And I was just watching and how they talk to people and how they embrace them with love and so forth. And that image really remained in me. Now, and Lensu and Asti and others, they have a good life in Addis, and they could simply say, like, let's just live our life and so forth. And why even leave the United States when she did, and Asti from Germany and so forth? That is because of the concern, being a concerned Christians. So that is, I think, the legacy of Gudina Tumsa. It's like being a concerned Christians, that you be concerned about the lost people, those who have never heard of the gospel, and be concerned about the human rights situation in your own context and your own people, so that you do something about it, but still based on the gospel of Christ.
Amen. Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. We want to thank you for the time that you gave us, Dr. Samuel Yonas, and it was a very fruitful interview for us. And we hope to continue our discussions some other time. Thank you.